can see it starting recording here.
Sounds good. Good luck.
Thank you, Mark.
All right. Nope, that's not going to work. How about back here? Okay. I think we've got the technology figured out here. So we're going to get started. Thanks a lot for coming out for Sugarbush valuation this morning. We are going to talk about how we look at Sugarbush real estate. So the dirt, the trees, the structures. We're going to do a little bit of covering pipeline as well. Although we won't do a lot of other personal property, I'll leave that up to the equipment dealers. So we're going to really focus on real estate and fixtures to real estate. So the goals of the presentation are to tell you a little bit about what we do in Sugarbush valuation and why. Answer some of your questions. I'm gearing this toward, like, if you were going to sell a Sugarbush or if you were going to buy a Sugarbush, here's what to look for, here's what to avoid. I'll give you some war stories where, you know, people lost some money, and I think it'd be good for people to understand what not to do as well as what to do. I had a question last week about whether we're talking about existing Sugarbush or just developed Sugarbush. And I think the talk really applies to both. You know, obviously there's some advantages to having an existing tapped Sugarbush. You have an idea of, you know, you probably have power there. You have an idea where the pipeline corridors are. There's probably not as much underbrush, but there also might not be as some other things that are advantageous in a brand new Sugarbush, like maybe some marketable timber or a fully untapped tree with a full tapping zone. You know, I'm working in a Sugarbush that's been tapped for 60 years, and I'm really interested in what Mark's doing because I think I'm going to be tapping under the lateral now, because there's a whole section here that's dead, and I'm sure you folks have seen that. So let me start off with a little bit of information on myself and what I do. I work out of Shazy, New York, in St. Albans, Vermont. I'm a certified real estate appraiser. So there's a government certification to be an appraiser if you're going to do real estate. I cover Vermont, New York, and part of New Hampshire. So a lot of the sugaring territory. And I work for Yankee Farm Credit. I'm a staff appraiser, the manager of the appraisal department. But we also do what we call fee appraisals. So for folks who are not gaining financing, we might do something to help set a sale price, to settle an LLC, that kind of thing. Requirements for certified general license, basically an apprenticeship. So I went through the classroom hours. I did an apprenticeship with a certified appraiser for 3,000 hours, took the federal exam, and now I do my CE. But where I really gained my education is I operate a small Sugarbush in West Shazy myself, and I talk to a lot of sugar makers. So when you hike with a sugar maker for a couple hours through the Sugarbush, if you shut your mouth and open your ears, you can actually learn a lot. So I want to make a distinction between an appraisal and an assessment, because I think, especially in Vermont, that gets a little confusing for people because the listers tend to use the word an appraisal, and what they're doing is not actually an appraisal, it's a municipal assessment. So an appraisal is someone giving an expert estimate of value for something. Uses market data to determine the value of an asset. So it could be for real estate, it could be for personal property, that's an appraisal. An assessment is a value that's calculated by an assessor, a municipal person, for the taxing authority to determine how much taxes you're going to be paying. In some cases, that may be fairly close to market value. In some cases, it may not be. If you look at the value after your current use reduction is taken, that has very little relationship to market value. And you would certainly buy property for that, but you would never sell it for that. So, you know, there's the distinction we're trying to make. What I'm talking about today is an appraisal. So it's all based on market data, and I'm going to tell you how we look at that market data and obtain it. So there's different types of value, even within the appraisal field. We just talked about the tax value. A good talking point here is business value. Business value would include all the assets of the business. So it's not just the real estate. You also have personal property involved, the pipeline, the equipment, the labor and management, those would all be wrapped into a business value. And often that's arrived at by taking your business income and capitalizing it into a value. But you need to realize that that business income is created by more than real estate alone. It's by all factors of production. Another value that you're often going to see is an insurance value, especially on buildings. That typically is not related to market value. If your sugar house burns down, it doesn't matter what it was worth if you could sell it. It matters what are you going to need to rebuild it. So that's an insurance value. And then sentimental value, we threw that in there because oftentimes we see that with real estate. You know, if you're buying grandpa's farm back from somebody that bought it a generation ago, you might pay more than the market would bear for that. That's perfectly fine, but that's not necessarily market value. So when we're looking at market value, that's a specific thing. It's the probable price. If you put the property on an open market, competitive open market with proper marketing, what could you get for this piece of property? And so we'll get into the details of that definition a little bit here. So I've highlighted some of the, I didn't realize that was there. So I've highlighted some of the big things here. Typically motivated, so that speaks to the sentimental value a little bit. Are you distressed or overly anxious to get that particular piece of property? Are you distressed the other way, where you're in a hard financial situation and you need to liquidate it? That might not reflect market value either. This is an interesting one. Well-informed or well-advised? Marketing, so that brings up the question, what is adequate marketing for a Sugarbush? I've seen Sugarbushes go on the market through the multiple listing service with a realtor. And you know, the pictures show the stream and the bridge crossing and the views, and they tell you how many deer are out there and how far you can see from the property. And then you get there and it's this bowl that all flows to one spot. It's 70% maple, that's all within tappable size, and the listing said nothing about it. So even though it was on the open market and everybody knew it was up for sale, unless you actually went and walked this piece of property, you would have no idea that it was a Sugarbush. So just because it's on the open market doesn't mean that it was adequately marketed as to its highest and best use. So we're looking for well-informed. That can mean many different things, but when we verify sales, we are really looking for, did the person marketing understand the context in which they were marketing this property? There are Sugarbushes in some parts of the world that have less value than residential parcels. In some areas, the sugaring use will outcompete the residential use. If your person marketing doesn't understand that dynamic, you may very well not have a good marketing plan. Both parties acting in their own best interest, that's fairly straightforward. You know, we typically exclude family transactions between business partners. Those typically don't reflect market value. Again, reasonable time allowed for exposure in the open market. So that speaks to marketing again, but specifically to how long was it allowed for exposure on the market. If we see something that closes in 2 days, I've got to question whether that was properly priced when it went on the market. US dollars, that's almost unnecessary to say, but unaffected by special or creative financing is an interesting one. We're looking for typical market rate financing. So we look into seller-held mortgages oftentimes, if that's the case. And so what we're looking for is a below market interest rate. We'll make adjustments to sales actually to bring it up to market interest rate. The theory being, if market interest rate is 5% and you can owner finance at 2%, you're willing to pay a little more for that property because your cash flow is going to be the same. Your payments would be the same due to the lower interest rate and a higher price. So here's the elements of market value. This is to kind of frame the discussion for you. So when I start talking about what we look at with Sugarbush and how we value these things, you need to understand the context in which we're looking at these properties. So parts of an appraisal, I'm going to try to go through this technical stuff fairly quickly because it is a little dry, but I think it's kind of important that if you get an appraisal report in front of you, you know what it says and why. All this stuff is federally mandated. We've got a book about like this that we have to follow. So, you know, we're not trying to charge by the pound, but you are going to get a fairly weighty document when you get an appraisal because a lot of this stuff is federally mandated. So, identification of the client. Who hired me to do this? Intended users. Who do I expect is going to read and use this appraisal report? I'm going to tailor it to their needs. Intended use. Why did I write this appraisal report? Effective date. What's the date of value? That determines which sales you're going to use. Anything that happened after that was not known in the market. So you're not going to use sales that happened after your effective date. The report date is simply, so if you make changes in the report, you update the report date. Obviously a property description. Scope of work is pretty important. What did I do? What did I not do? Maybe more importantly. Explanation of methods and appraisal used and excluded. We'll touch on that later. There's 3 really accepted approaches to appraisal, and we'll go through each one of them in detail. Summarization of analyses, rationale, and conclusion. There's really the meat of the report. This is the valuation part. This next part is a little known part of appraisal, but I think that's not a good thing because you really need to pay attention to these next 2 things. Extraordinary assumptions are something that I'm unsure of, but I'm going to assume that it's true for the purposes of the appraisal. I often use that for a tap count. The thing's undeveloped. Somebody thinks it's got about 20,000 taps out there. I'm going to assume that tap count is okay. If it comes in at 15,000, probably the value I gave isn't going to be right. So there's certain things that I need to assume. I need to assume that the pipeline corridor that goes across the neighbor's property can continue to be used. These are often driven by the client. So if I get to a spot where, you know, are you going to be able to go across this guy's land in the future? Do you want me to assume you can go across this guy's land in the future, or should I assume that that's going to be taken away from you? Read these carefully because these can have a major effect on value sometimes. The next one is a hypothetical condition. It's something that I know currently doesn't exist, but I appraise it as though it did. I know that sounds kind of odd, but if you're building a sugar house, when I went there, it wasn't there. You gave me schematics, plans, cost estimates. I'm going to appraise it as if it is there. That's a hypothetical condition that it currently exists. More common, not to do with buildings, would be like you're negotiating a right-of-way with the neighbor. And you're telling me that this is going to happen by the time I sell this piece of property. Let's assume that I've got the right-of-way done. This is really important. So now you go to sell this piece of property, you don't have a right-of-way yet. If that right-of-way falls through, the value I gave you based on a right-of-way access versus no access is not valid anymore. So these can have major impacts on value. We're seeing, you know, as much as 30-40% difference in value between something with a right-of-way and something that has just an informal access. It's a really huge part of what we do. So these are little known parts of an appraisal. Pay attention to them closely. I should mention, if anybody has any questions throughout, please, you know, just let me know, shout them out. I'm going through this stuff a little bit quickly because I'm trying to bring it into less than an hour and it's a lot of material. But please, I don't mind answering midstream. So moving on to highest and best use. This can be a complex concept and determination at times. In this presentation, we're going to assume that the highest and best use is a sugarbush. In this area, large parcels of land that have maples on them with reasonable access typically do have a highest and best use of maple. There aren't a lot of other uses out there that are going to outcompete a maple parcel in the maple market in this general vicinity. There are parts of New York, especially closer to the city, where you can have beautiful sugar bushes, physically very well suited, that probably don't have the highest and best use of maple sugaring. They probably have the highest and best use of residential. So the physical characteristics, the legal characteristics, what can I do with this property? And then maybe more importantly, the financial characteristics. what's gonna bring me the greatest return for this piece of property? That's what we're trying to determine. So we kind of, it's like we call it a funnel, but we narrow it down to what uses are physically and legally possible, and then we decide which one's gonna bring the highest return or the highest sale price. So how do we identify the property? Well, we go to the town, figure out what the assessment is, tax maps, deeds, surveys, reconcile discrepancies. This can be pretty major. Tax maps don't always match up with deeds and don't always match up with surveys. There can be great discrepancies. I did an appraisal not that long ago that got very much held up by this. The deed said 120 acres, the town said 180 acres, and nobody could figure out who owned what in the middle. There was surveys all around this parcel, but there was a huge acreage discrepancy. I advised this young man to make an offer based on a per acre and pay the $10,000 for the survey. If, looking at the big picture here, if he was gonna pay $350,000 for a piece of property, 10 grand for a survey probably in the long run was not going to be a big deal. But these things can hold up financing, they can hold up closing. Look for as many sources of acreage as possible. If there's a survey, that's absolutely the best. That means that somebody with a professional license has stamped, this is how many acres are out here, and he's certifying that he'll go to bat to defend his survey or her survey. Short of that, the town tax maps online can be different from the town tax map at the town office, which can be totally different from the survey. So be careful. Don't just assume that what the seller gave you is true.
Do you work with GPS figures at all?
We don't personally produce GPS maps.
What is the accuracy of those in terms of real estate measurement these days, do you know?
It depends who made it. Typically, if we're working with a GPS made map, it comes from a forester, and depending on their source, they can line up pretty well or not. I take the GPS map from because it's not a legal document, so that's the bottom line. A survey is a legal document that can be defended, and a GPS map can't be. So, although oftentimes we'll go and drop some points on the corners, that really is not legally defensible, and I need a survey to know for sure, are those where because a lot of times it's a blaze on a tree, right, not a pin. So is that really the corner, or is that the historic corner? There can be a lot of legal questions that come up with boundary disputes. I've seen 4-acre boundary disputes hold up a loan closing for a long time. So these can be serious issues. But a GPS can be very accurate, but it might not give you what you're looking for. So moving on from reconciling discrepancies, we do a lot of desktop inspection nowadays. We make maps, aerial maps, topography maps, soil maps, infrared photography. The red parts are the softwood and the lighter parts are the hardwood. If you haven't played around with the Agency of Natural Resources mapping tools, do it. They've got many base layers. You can look at on-site septic capacity, to slopes, to floodplain, wetlands. It's really an amazing tool here in Vermont. New York has something that's a little less robust, and New Hampshire has something that's fairly close to the Vermont version, although not quite as user-friendly. I'll show you some of these maps soon here. Physical inspection can be walking through the bush. We can ride a four-wheeler. We don't have a helicopter, but it'd be nice. Maybe drones will be in the future. That's a possibility. Although seeing a sugarbush from the top most times a year isn't going to give you a whole lot. So we really do a lot of hiking and riding around. We don't necessarily need to see the pins. That's what we rely on the survey for. So I'm going to take the surveyor's word for it that it's out there. What I want to see is the big ravine in the middle, and I want to know how you're going to get across it with your transportation lines. Or I want to see the low point in the back that you're going to have to pump from because this parcel pitches in 2 directions. Those are the kind of things that I want to see. I want to see your bottlenecks, if you will. And I don't want to see all the 80 tap per acre stands. I'd also like to see the mixed stand and take a look at the softwood that's out there as well. So here's a sample map. You can see you got an aerial photograph with an overlay of topography lines. This is all going to slope that runs this way toward the road. This would have excellent access, good slope. This is the same parcel in Google Earth. So this is a really cool tool. We create these maps, we export the file, and then we load it into Google Earth. So it's almost like we're flying in a helicopter on the side of it. So the other one was kind of like hard to conceive of what was going on. Now you can see you've got a nice flat spot at the road, you've got a fairly steep spot, and then it sort of plateaus out at the top. These are really great things for us to kind of understand how the parcel lays, especially with larger parcels where you can't really hike the whole thing. As you get in, we can walk a few hundred acres. A couple thousand takes a long time. So these are really, really beneficial to us. So I'll get into the approaches to value. There's 3 recognized approaches to value. We've got the sales comparison approach, direct comparison against recent sales. That's the most commonly used in Sugarbush appraisal. We've got the cost approach, which is what would it cost me to build this, minus how much it's depreciated at this point. And then we've got the income approach, which we've already touched on a little bit with talk about business value and how that differs from real estate value, but I will bring this back to an income approach that's a little different from your owner-operator income statement. The bottom line here is I'm trying to reflect buyer sentiment. So when I go onto a piece of property, I'm trying to figure out if I was looking to buy this, what would I pay for it? If I was a market participant right now, what would I pay for this piece of property? So I'm really trying to think like a buyer, and when I'm analyzing these properties, I'm trying to reflect buyer sentiment. So all of these approaches rely on market data and analysis of real estate sales, market data, to come up with a value opinion. And you can see 1, 2, or 3 approaches. Just because you only see one approach doesn't necessarily mean that it's an invalid appraisal. It doesn't mean that the person did the wrong thing. For certain property types, it doesn't make sense. Like for a cost approach, if it's land only, there's really no reason to do a cost approach. The sales comparison approach establishes your land value anyhow in a cost approach. The cost approach is really applicable to new buildings or to slightly older buildings that you can get some market depreciation data on. So the sales comparison approach literally takes the subject property and compares it to sales of similar properties. We're going to make adjustments because no 2 pieces of real estate are the same, obviously. So how do we get these adjustments? Well, we look in the market to find them. We're pairing different sales. We're actually analyzing maybe statistical analysis to analyze larger quantities of data. If the sale is better, like let's say your sale has some road frontage and the piece of property that you're looking to buy or sell is on a right-of-way. Clearly, something with road frontage is going to have more value than up on a right-of-way, assuming the road frontage has some utility. Of course, there are exceptions to all these rules, so I'm speaking in broad terms. If the sale is inferior, so if your sale is superior to your parcel, you're going to draw the sale down to reflect a lower value for your parcel. If the sale is inferior to your parcel, you're going to adjust the sale up to reflect the fact that your parcel is better. So what you're doing is, let's say your sale was $1,200 an acre. It was on a right-of-way. Yours has road frontage. We may adjust it up by a certain percentage to reflect the increased utility of the road frontage, maybe a subdivision potential. These are some judgment, but you see it in the data. When we start looking at parcels with road frontage versus parcels with a right-of-way, we literally see value differences, and we try to reflect those in our adjustments. So as I've said, we're doing trend analysis. So these are kind of like time analyses to see if there's differences over time. I will tell you, since about 2011, 2012, when the syrup price started to to come back down, we saw real estate values kind of stabilize. From 08 to 11 or 12, we saw things spike. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. The price of syrup went up by 20%, 25%, and the real estate values followed it. Match paired sales are a lot of what we do as well. Again, let's take a look at the road frontage versus right of way. If we have a sale that sold for $1,500 and it has an acre and it has road frontage, very similar sale otherwise nearby, same density, similar slope and pitch. It's up on a right of way and it sells for $1,200 an acre. We've got a $300 difference that is only explainable by the difference in access. Those are the kind of paired sales analyses that we're doing to determine these adjustments. So these aren't just pulled out of thin air. We actually look at market data and large quantities of it to determine this. Now the discussion with buyers and sellers, as I alluded to earlier, is probably the most important part of it. I'm trying to determine why are you paying more for this? A lot of times it's pretty obvious. And how much does it impact your purchase decision? What we've seen recently is that people are becoming more comfortable with pumping sap. So the technology has come a long way, people's comfort level has come a long way. We've actually seen a reduction in the difference in value between parcels that pitch to the road 100% and parcels that partially pitch away from the road. People are just not as scared to pump sap up over the knoll anymore. So we're seeing actually that the two are getting closer together. So we've determined through discussion and then looking at the data that that's becoming less important to sugar makers. And that speaks exactly to the size of the adjustment. We used to make fairly large adjustments for parcels that pitched the wrong way. Now we're moderating that a little bit because we're finding that people aren't as scared to pump sap anymore. The next most commonly used approach for properties with buildings is the cost approach. So this is based on the premise that I'm not going to pay you more for what you own than it would cost me to go buy something similar. I mean, that basically creates a ceiling, right? I mean, if I could build a new sugar house for $100,000, I'm not going to pay you $125 for yours. That doesn't make any sense. So how do we determine this? Well, we look at the market. So if you've ever been with an appraiser, all they do is ask you, well, why are you paying that? How much did that cost? What did you have into that? It's because we're trying to determine some things for the cost approach here. We're trying to understand what it costs to set things up, what kind of money you have into things that we don't necessarily see, roads, power. These things can get fairly expensive. And so we're looking at base land value plus improvements, and then we're trying to depreciate this. Now, it's an important distinction to make. We're not using straight line tax or tax depreciation. That probably doesn't reflect what's going on in the market. We typically see some what we call lost capital. And that is basically, the best way I can explain that is when you buy a car and you drive it off the lot, and you turn around and try to go trade that car back in. You're not going to get what you just paid for it. It's very similar in the real estate market. If you're going to sell a 2-year-old sugar house, you're probably going to take a little bit of a hit on it. We see about a 15% hit. Now, why is that? Well, if anyone's ever built a house, they realize that as soon as you drive the last nail, you wish you'd have done something a little bit different. It's very similar. The market changes so quickly for these things that they lose value that quickly. I was just in a sugar house not that long ago that was built in the 70s. And at the time, your headroom was like right here. And the reason they did that was so that they could get the steam out quicker. They had this whole hood structure, but literally the rafters were right here. You can't put a piggyback on the evaporator. You can't even put a good hood on the back of it because your ceiling's so low. That is what we call functional depreciation. That directly relates to what somebody would pay for that sugar house because the ceilings in most of the sugar house are this height. Now, that's an extreme example, but as technology changes, these structures lose their value. Another really great one is a fully operational sugar house that was built in the bucket days, where you put it in the middle of the woods and you brought everything into it. Well, nowadays, you want them on the road frontage, because typically your access is more important than bringing everything to one spot. And that might not be the low point of the land to begin with. So those sugar houses that are located out in the woods nowadays have very minimal value for commercial sugar makers. Go ahead.
I should have asked you the last slide, but do you adjust for geography? In other words, the difference between, say, Franklin County and Bennington County, and also the scarcity? I mean, appraisal's historic, and if things are scarce, they go up.
That is a great question. That is a great question. We start with the primary factor in choice of comps being geographic location. And that kind of solves those two problems at once. So we try to go as close to the subject as possible, which is going to reflect elevation, geography, and local demand. And so if we have to pull a comparable sale from the other side of the state, that can be problematic. So we really try not to do that. Now, as properties get really big, 5,000 acres, the scarcity thing starts to come into play, and we're actually seeing values equalizing across large geographic regions because the buyer pools are fairly small, the properties don't come up for sale that often in that size class, and we're not seeing as much variation on those very large properties as in the local markets here. We all know, I think we're all fairly familiar with Franklin County having really high land values both for cropland and for Sugarbush. So I try to stay out of Fairfield and Fletcher if I'm appraising anywhere else, because there really is a hotbed there, and we're seeing it in the value. So we try to stay as geographically close as possible. So I should, give a range, because I think people are understandably interested in what are you seeing out in the market. So I'm going to give you this huge broad range that covers my whole area, from $750 to $4,000 an acre. So what I'm trying to do is narrow this range down for you. So the baseline, that's a great question. The baseline is, what are the local sales selling for? So these adjustments that we're going to talk about in this next section, the second half is way more interesting. We're going to talk about sugaring and sugar bushes. The adjustments that I'm talking about need to be applied to local sales. If you're applying them to sales that are too far away, you might not be reflecting your local market. Going back in time can be problematic, but at this point, I'm going back as far as 2012 pretty comfortably because it's been a flat market. Before that, I was making upward time, I call them market condition adjustments or time adjustments to reflect the changing market. At this point, we're not seeing that. Hopefully, the price of syrup is going to come back a little bit, and we're not going to see it go back the other way, but I'm not going to determine that until I see some sales. Moving on, continuing on with the cost approach. How do we determine cost to build? Well, we finance a lot of projects at Yankee Farm Credit, and we keep all that data. When I'm walking your property with you, I'm constantly asking you what it costs you to build that, what it costs you to build this, and those are the notes that I'm taking. Physical depreciation is pretty simple. It's age life. If it's a 40-year structure and it's 10 years old, it's a quarter used up. Then the other depreciation is what I talked about before. Functional depreciation, low ceiling height, sugar houses in the wrong spot. Economic depreciation, what we call lost capital, it's like the new car effect. Buyer's going to pay less than the cost due to the changing market and standards and economic conditions. So the income approach is not well understood, I don't think. I think the cost, sales comparison, comparing your subject parcel to recent sales is pretty intuitive. The cost approach makes some sense. What does it cost? I'm not going to pay any more than it cost me to build the same thing. The income approach is commonly misunderstood. People always think of owner-operator income approach. And that's not really appropriate for the reasons I talked about before. You've got all these other factors of production. But it does make sense that the more income that a property can produce, the more you can pay for it. Because all else being equal, you're going to end up with the same profit. So that's what this That's what this is trying to represent. Your present value is the anticipated future benefit that you're going to receive from this property, discounted over time. Now that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but on an owner-operator, you're going to be looking at what's $10 gross, $5 net. If you're going to pay $25 a tap for this piece of property, you're going to pay it off in 5 years, right? Well, no. What about the pipeline and the evaporator and the other equipment that's required? So we're trying to get down, even with an owner-operator, just to the real estate value. How do I do that? Well, it's very subjective. Where is that profit generated? Of that $5, how much is real estate? How much is management? How much is personal property? So what we actually do is a rental based. So we're looking at what are market rents in the area, and if you were to rent this property out, pay the income taxes and maybe an umbrella policy so that you don't get sued, what kind of income would you get from that property as a rental based landlord? Now, most people don't buy these properties to rent them out, they buy them to operate them. But this strips out all those other factors of production and leaves you with just a land value. Because when you're renting something out, there's no other risk involved beyond renting to the wrong person who doesn't pay you. But you don't have those other factors of production mixed in there. So this is why we're doing a rental based. So everything here is based on market data. And I think it's important for folks to understand that, this is really where we do most of our work here, gathering this data. The due diligence that goes into verifying sales is probably the most important part of the process that we do. I was just in the field walking with someone the other day, and they were talking about a recent real estate transaction in northern Vermont, and he said, I heard he got that for free. And I thought to myself, wow, the rumor mill works really well, but it does not convey accurate information really well. Because he definitely did not get that piece of property for free. So this is the kind of stuff that, we hear shades of truth and half-truths, and the bottom line is, unless you can verify it with municipal records, with knowledgeable people who understand what happened in the transaction, you probably haven't got the full picture. So a lot of what real estate appraisers do is we go and talk to buyers and sellers. We'll probably call the broker. We might ask the town clerk, depending on the town. We might stop at Chester's and find out what they know. These are the kind of things that we're doing. We're out in the countryside talking to people on a regular basis. That's where we get our information. Now, of course, we're using websites, but the physical characteristics are pretty easy to come up with. It's, what was the financing? How is this thing marketed? Did anybody else give any offers on this thing? Or was it just offered to the guy that's been renting it for 10 years and maybe isn't really reflective of what they could have got on the open market? So the most important parts of what we look at in the data analysis, terms of sale, I talked about this. How is this thing marketed? That's so important to an actual value level. It's interesting that I see very similar physical attributes on two different parcels. One was well marketed, one was not. The sale prices can be vastly different. So we're trying to weed out the sales that don't reflect market value because they were poorly marketed or uninformed buyer, uninformed seller. Physical attributes, again, fairly easy to come up with. We're in a disclosure state where you can actually go to the town clerk, you can get the documents, you can figure out what this person, it's all recorded information that's available to anyone if they take the time to go get it. This might be a little bit tougher to come up with. You got to know how to read deeds, and they're a little dense, but this is really important. Easements can have a major impact on value, whether they be easements to the neighbor, conservation easements to like the Vermont Land Trust, major impacts on value. Leases can really impact value. When you're trying to sell a piece of property that's got a long-term lease on it, that can really affect your market for that piece of property. So that's really one of the most important parts of the appraisal process is verification of this data. So some general concepts that we apply. I mean, most of this stuff is fairly intuitive, but better land should sell for more per acre and should command higher rents than poorer quality land. That's pretty, that makes sense. Substitution, like we talked about in the cost approach, someone's not going to pay more for an item than it would cost to replace it with another item of equal utility. That being said, we need to recognize that the real estate market isn't perfect. It's not like going to buy a car where you can do a bunch of research online before you even show up at the dealership, and you know if he's giving you a good price or a bad price when you get there. When it comes to real estate, there's not enough information available, there's not enough knowledgeable people to give you that information, and online searches only give you the tip of the iceberg. So what we see is that, not all transactions meet the definition of market value, and of those that do, there's still some variation in the market data. People are highly motivated, sometimes they're not highly motivated. It all depends on who's in the market at a given time. And so you're going to get some variation in the real estate market, which is why it's really difficult to put your finger on what exactly is a piece of real estate worth. The sale price may or may not be indicative of the market value of a piece of real estate. I'm gonna get moving. So the main considerations: access, electrical service, density, ease of operation, and then I'll cover some other amenities. So we'll start with access. Best access is road frontage, directly on a developed, maintained public road. So we're looking at development potential given zoning. Could you subdivide a lot and sell it off without impacting the maple operation? How far, this is an important one, how far does the town plow? And could it be plowed further if you wanted to do it yourself? Class 4 roads can be problematic for sugar makers. Road frontage that's steep or swampy may have no value over right-of-way access. And then a big one here, does the road frontage access the low point, the midpoint, the high point? That can be really important to your ease of operation. Next down on the hierarchy here is a right-of-way access. So a right-of-way is not a road. A right-of-way is a legal right to cross someone else's property. There may or may not be a road there. Interestingly enough, I did a project not that long ago where I showed up, we rode up the driveway, we got up, did the parcel. I hadn't been to the town clerk's yet, so I assumed that was the right-of-way, and went to the town clerk's office to find the survey that showed me the right-of-way is not where the driveway is. So I go back to the parcel, and it turns out that the right-of-way is a mess of brush and swamp and trees. The value of that parcel has totally changed now. There's no developed access on the right-of-way. Do not assume that a road either has a legal right to use it or is located on the legal right that you have that's called the right-of-way. Another interesting point is that you may or may not be able to set a tank in a right-of-way or run a pipeline down a right-of-way. Oftentimes, you have the right to cross someone else's property, not to use it to set your equipment on. So be careful with these right-of-way access. A handshake deal can fall apart with the next buyer. So just because there's been a tank there for 20 years doesn't mean there's a legal right to put it there, and you better look into those kind of things.
I have a quick question on right away. When in the old days they would give someone a right away to give you the property, Sugarbush and that. This happened to some friends of mine where the person that wanted to buy that Sugarbush decided his son, but then he sold the farm meadow, so the guy built a nice big house, way up around here.
Yep.
This guy that was supposed to go across over here, he wanted to come off right by his house and get over to the property. And you say it right away, is it anywhere you want it?
Typically, it's well defined. Either it meets and bounds.
They just said it right away. So,
Well, get legal advice.
yeah, well, I just wondered, because it wasn't me, I'm just.
Right, no, I'm just saying, in those situations, I really recommend getting some legal advice. Real estate is extremely expensive, and your rights associated with that can have a major impact on value. The best right-of-ways have fairly broad terms, allow you to use them for residential uses, for basically any use, utilities. I've seen right-of-ways that are only for ingress and egress, coming and going. There's no mention of utilities, there's no mention of other uses. So you really literally have no right to bring utilities up that right-of-way. So you may actually, a good story, well I guess it's a bad story, but There was a fellow who bought a piece of property in the Northeast Kingdom with the assumption he was going to be able to extend power up the existing right-of-way, and indeed he had the right to use that road to get in and out, but the neighbor said, no, you're not bringing power up there. So he bought this thing thinking he could. Now he's running a generator. I don't believe he's too happy with that result. So be careful and understand what your legal rights are, and just because someone's been using something for a period of time doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to use it after you buy it. Landlocked means no legal right to access the property on a regular basis. Vermont does allow you to access any piece of property for logging on a periodic basis. That doesn't necessarily mean you can go there 40 days a year during mud season. So just because you have access for logging doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to sugar that parcel. And if you can't get there and get the sap out, it's really a timber parcel. And so landlocked parcels really have a lot less value. Again, a developed road that people have been using for generations may or may not be a legal right. Really look into these things. The market for landlocked parcels is very small. We see over a 50% reduction in value for landlocked parcels because your buyer pool is basically the abutting landowners, and sometimes they play hardball. Electrical service, power provided by a public utility. So this is pretty easy to figure out. If it's developed on site, it's not that expensive. If it's at the road, you're going to need to put a pole in and drop a power service. That gets a little more expensive. If it's at a distance, you're even more expensive. Paying the utility is fairly expensive to bring in power. The big thing to look at is if you're willing to pay the utility to bring it in, can easements be obtained? Before you buy the piece of property, make sure you're going to be able to bring the power in the way that you need to bring it in to make it cost effective. I've seen people buy parcels and have to bring power in from another direction, and it can get very costly. But once your money's in the real estate, you're going to do what you got to do to get sap out of that thing. Of course, running a generator is inferior to running municipal power, and that's just easier to run municipal power. So we do see a little reduction in value for generator operated parcels. Density is an interesting talking point. So all else being equal, same access, same ease of operation, same location, more taps on an acre equals higher value per acre. That is clear in the data. We typically see density for Sugarbush in the range of 40 on the low end to up to 100. We typically cap it before 100. We're actually capping our adjustments at 85 because differences in management have such a large impact on tap counts that I get a little nervous about using tap counts. You start riding through the bush and you see a lot of 6 and 4 inch trees tap, and you start wondering, where is my density exactly with new management? So what are we basing these on? So a lot of times we're trying to get a forester's report to try to figure out how many taps are out there divided by acreage equals density, taps per acre. So what we're using to standardize these things when we can get forestry reports are basically the current use and NOFA guidelines. Those are the predominantly used guidelines in this area. Current use looks like it's different, but it's actually not. This is a 2-inch size class, so 10 to 14 actually goes from 9 to 15. They're almost exactly the same. So we're standardizing everything. If we get that being said, it's still variable. Differences in management affect tap counts. Different firms that are marketing Sugarbush are more optimistic than others. So be aware and do your due diligence. If you're going to spend a lot of money on on real estate, I really recommend getting a forester to give you an independent tap count that didn't come from a broker. So I am interested in what people think about maximum density. Where do we see a ceiling in density? Does anyone have something that they're tapping over 100 trees per acre? No. Anybody over 90?
I have a couple sections of my woods that are between 85 and 95.
Okay.
I measured them and counted them
Yep.
and calculated it.
Yep.
Then I have some that's 32,
So what's your overall average?
71.
Okay, that's fairly high on the scale. Most of our data is between 40 and 70. So is anybody, and I would assume that most fall into that range. You know, when I do a rough count out in the field, I'm taking a 60-foot radius and counting the trees in that radius and multiplying by 4. That gives me some approximation of what's in that location. Now, if I'm walking 500 acres, how many of these points can I do? I'm not a forester. I'm actually only out there for a couple hours, not 4 or 5 days. So there's limits to that. Although density is one of the biggest factors, we try not to rely too heavily upon it. Ease of operation is my next point. We're measuring the operability of the parcel versus the ideal, which is theoretical, obviously, but general concepts are slope. Does it go away or toward the access point? Is it draining to one location, multiple locations? Although we're not scared to pump sap, we would rather it come to the sugar house or to the pump house than to go have to check that remote tank out there. So that certainly affects what people are paying. Pitch, how steep is the parcel? I've gone on my hands and knees to inspect some parcels and wondered on a year like this how exactly they were going to tap that piece. And then any big ravines that would impact tubing layout. So this can be fairly significant. You know, getting from one side of the parcel to another, that could be the difference between one pump station and 2 pump stations. Internal roads are fairly important. Access to the back of the woods, as you folks all know, is pretty important to a sugaring operation. And if you have to go on foot every time, it's not as much fun as riding your snowmobile. And what are the quality of the existing roads? And then underbrush. Although I don't think this is a huge factor, I do see some impact on operability and therefore on income potential. So these all relate to how easy is it to bring in the sap to your collection point. So we're basically out of time, so I'm going to speed through this a little bit, but to illustrate a good point of what we're talking about and kind of summarize what this is about, here's a sample piece of property. You've got your road frontage here. We're looking at this thing by itself. Clearly, it's going to flow to this corner here. These are the topography lines. We've got 700, we got 400, there's a stream down here. This is where you're going to collect sap. And then you're going to pump it back to the road frontage. That's how most people would operate this parcel. Now let's say you're applying for financing and you're putting this up as your piece of collateral for the loan. And you own this piece over here as well. If there's a big difference from an appraisal standpoint between appraising this by itself and appraising both sides. Because this is so much higher and you have road frontage over here as well. If this side is included, you can shoot over the stream and bring sap to a road frontage. If it's all by itself, you're pumping from this back corner. So be aware of what you're buying and what's being appraised, because it can have an impact on the value. So to this landowner, this property might be worth more than market value because it might add value to their whole parcel that's over and above the market value of this piece by itself. Other amenities we look at are stuff that costs money. Drilled well, municipal water, dug well, spring on your own land. Do you have the right to use a spring on somebody else's land? Wastewater disposal. You know, if you've got a approved working septic versus a permit versus just a perk test, There's differences in how much it's gonna cost you to develop this piece if you decide that you want a septic system. Lease income can be significant. There's some, up by me, there's some large wind towers that really provide a lot of income, about $6,000–7,000 a year typically per wind tower to the landowner. Those can have major impacts on property value, obviously. Hunting leases, recreational leases, a little less common around here. Timber is a moving target. You gotta, low value timber rate, low end timber right now, you can't barely get rid of your chips at this point. So that's really a market that's dried up. So if you're looking at timber valuation from 5 or 6 years ago, you might need to update that to understand what your timber value is today. If you've got some other nice timber beyond the maple, you might actually have more value above and beyond what the maple value is, based on the fact that you can cut some of this off and still end up with a sugar bush. So we look at that as well. And other land types, you know, not every sugar bush is just sugar bush. So we're also looking at cropland typically has more value than wetlands. I think that's all pretty intuitive based on what the uses of that stuff can be. To wrap up, I do want to talk about pipeline for a couple minutes because I think it really interests people how we look at pipeline. Who uses their pipeline for 10 years, changes it all out? Nobody's doing that. Well, some people are doing that. 15 years? No? Yeah? I mean, that's difficult to tell what the useful life of maple pipeline is. I'm working with a system that's 25 years old, and the old theory was that you put your transportation lines down on the stream, and then you bring everything to it. And there's times when I'm working on the pipeline, and I'm standing 40 feet above the sap house going, why does it go in the hole before it goes to the sugar house? That doesn't make any sense. So clearly this stuff still has some useful life. We're still making 4 pounds per tap, yet if I was going to put a new pipeline in, it certainly would not go all into the hole before it goes back to the sugar house. So those are the kind of things. Changing technology can make pipeline worthless when it still has some remaining physical life. Production history can give you some indication of the value of pipeline. It's not perfect, but if you have a really terrible system, you're not going to be making 6 pounds per tap. If you have a really good system, you could still make 2 pounds per tap. That's possible, but it's really hard to manage a bad system to good production. So if you have poor production and management's been pretty reasonably good, chances are the pipeline is poorly laid out. So I like to liken it to used concrete. You can buy used concrete. It might come with a piece of real estate. If it's in the right spot and it's in good shape, maybe you'll build a garage there. If it's in the wrong spot and it's in poor shape, it's going to cost you to get it out of there. Same thing with pipeline. If it's in the right spot, it might have some value. If it's poorly laid out, it can literally detract from value. I was on a piece of property this summer where, for whatever reason, this guy decided to run a lot of main lines against the grade. So in some spots they were down here, and in some spots they were way up here, and it made no sense at all, and clearly this pipeline was worth nothing. It was 2 years old. So it's really difficult to put your finger on exactly what the value of this pipeline is, and I'm not going to walk 20 miles of pipeline to try to figure out how it's laid out. But I guess just be aware that useful life may not match physical life. The other thing I should point out about pipeline is it makes really poor collateral. We hate to take it at the bank because it's pretty difficult to sell used plastic. That's the bottom line. So don't be surprised when your banker tells you that your pipeline is not going to be used in collateral. It's just difficult for us to take a piece of property that has no recovery value as collateral. So I'll leave it at that because that could be a little contentious. But coming from a banking standpoint, the whole idea of collateral is to have something if somebody stops paying. Pipeline is not much of something.